Hello and welcome to another episode from Restoration DIY. And whether this is your first visit or you've been here before, it's great to have you and I hope you enjoy the video. This time I make a bowl from an oak blank cast into epoxy resin with a segmented rim. So without further ado, let's get into it. After supergluing a waste block to the oak blank, I got straight into mixing the epoxy resin. No changes from my usual process. I used my favoured brand, mixed to the manufacturer's recommendations. The colour I wanted for this project was a light raspberry red, or close to it. So I used red and white mica powder with a few drops of red alcohol dye. So with the colours added to 3 batches, I thoroughly mixed each one. The manufacturer recommends 4 minutes for a single batch, but to be honest, I don't do much more than 2 minutes. Now having said that, what you do if you ever mix epoxy resin is completely up to you. This is what works for me. With all 3 mixed, I added them to the casting, but there wasn't enough to give me the height I wanted, so I mixed one more batch, which topped it up level with the top of the waste block. Then I added some weight to hold everything in place, and I put the whole thing in the pressure pot. Adding the 4th batch means that I run the risk of the casting cracking due to overheating whilst it's curing, but the ambient temperatures were quite cold, so I figured I would risk it. After a final check to make sure nothing had moved, I screwed the lid on and added 50 to 55 psi. Same day, and with the resin curing off to one side, I made the segmented rim. Using the bandsaw, I cut a length of oak down to approximately 55 by 35 millimeters, the width and depth of the segments. And after a quick pass through the drum sander, out came the miter saw, set to 10 degrees, cut the individual pieces. First I made an angled cut, then I marked out the long side at 42 millimeters, clamped a stock block on the saw fence, and then I cut 18 segments. Normally I would cut these on the table saw, but with so few to do, this was quicker. When making shortcuts like this, you just have to make sure the saw stops before lifting the blade up to make the next cut. Each segment was then sanded to remove the scraggy bits, and then I could assemble the rim. The glue I'm using is Type Bond 2. Making sure I got plenty on, as this is all end grain, I glued up 6 at a time. And with the last piece in place, I used a hose clamp to apply even pressure and tighten the joints up. The excess glue was wiped off and the ring was left overnight for the glue to set up. It's the next day and time to remove the casting. With the pressure released, the blank looked okay, apart from the colour. I was aiming for light raspberry, but I ended up with orange. So orange it is. The next small issue was I'd forgotten to wax the bucket, so the blank was well and truly stuck. No amount of bashing would make it move, so I had to cut it free. Quick check to make sure the segmented rim would fit, then I marked the centre and drilled a hole for the woodworm screw. the next stage, the blank was fixed to the lathe using the tailstock for added security. With the lathe turned up to around 1000 RPM, the main task was to flatten the top of the blank. But first I needed to cut a mortise so I could turn the blank around and fix it in the forge or chuck. With the blank turned around and secured on the forge or chuck, I set to flattening the top. For this I used the 1/2 inch bowl gouge to remove the raised section of the waste block, then I shear scraped to remove the ridges before switching to the skew chisel to level it off. When I was happy it was nice and level, I turned my attention to the segmented rim. This had been sat overnight and the glue had cured, so the next job was to run this through the drum sander. I only needed one level side to mate it with a resin blank, but I did both whilst I was at it. I cut this bit short. It takes around 6 to 8 passes to sand each side. I put the drill bit back in the hole it drilled. Using this I could measure off it to the outer edge of the rim to get it centred. Once it was in position, I scratched a line in the blank so I could easily realign it, and next I glued the rim to the blank, using a small amount of resin coloured the same as the rest. I placed the blank in a silicone baking tray to catch any dribbles and spread a thin layer of resin in the area the rim would sit. And once I had everything in position, I used hot melt glue to secure it in place. And with the drill bit removed, I added the excess resin to the centre so that it would fill in the gaps. Then I placed some weight on top and left it in a warm room to cure overnight. Another day has passed and the rim has bonded to the blank with no visible gaps. So I fixed it back on the lathe using the woodworm screw and the tailstock to secure it in place, but somehow the blank was off centre, so it needed a bit of realignment. With that done, I turned the lathe up to around 1000 RPM and set to getting the bolt around. Using the Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher, I began removing material. I gradually worked my way down to the timber blank in the base, hoping it would be more or less centred, but as I got closer, I could see it had moved to one side in the casting. This left me with a couple of options. I could keep on going until I'd cut through all the resin, so I just had timber left. But this would dramatically reduce the diameter of the base and probably the finished piece. Or I could go down a little bit further and just leave some resin showing. I decided on the latter, as this would give me more options in the final design, and as it turned out, I needed it. With most of the resin removed, I switched over to the bowl gouge. First I trued the upper surface. The resin was still on the soft side, so it cut very well. Then I began shaping the base. Before I started, I knew I was going to form a pedestal, so using the gouge, I cut into the timber to form the cutout, as ever being careful not to get a catch on the open blade. If you look closely, you can see me rolling the gouge over as I near the base of the cut. Doing this presents the lower blade to the opposite side, which I use to shear scrape as I back out of the cut. Next I switched over to the detail spindle gouge. This has a swept back fingernail grind, so I can form a much sharper angle in the base of the cut. I use it in the same way as the bowl gouge, but as this is a 3/8 spindle gouge, it chatters quite a lot, forming ridges on the surface, so I've ordered a new 1/2 inch version, which I hope will eliminate the problem. After a bit of reprofiling to the top of the cutout, I moved on to the rim. Now sadly I lost the first few clips due to shavings on the lens, but moving on, most of the shaping was done with a 1/2 inch bowl gouge. I began by getting the segments to round, keeping the outer diameter as large as possible. Then I formed the undercut, using a combination of push cuts and shear scraping. So with the rim done, I finalised the shape of the outer surface, using the skew chisel to blend and fair the curves. I also made the cutout a bit deeper, and using the carbide cutter, I added a radius around the outer edge of the base. And with that done, I moved on to the mortise. This needed to be redone because I had to recenter the blank after the first one was cut. First, I levelled the underside, then I recut the outer edge of the recess with a 1/4 inch parting tool. Then I cut a new dovetail with a dovetail cutter. Next, I used a spindle gouge to clean up the inner material before I removed the tailstock so I could add some embellishment, and then I sanded the outer surface from 80 to 3000 grit. Sanding done, I added a finish, which at this point I'm not going to go through. I'll show it in detail at the end, but when it was done, it looked like this. I was very happy with how things were going. I turned the bowl around, secured it in place with the 4-jaw chuck and the tailstock, and then I began hollowing out. I used the 1/2 inch bowl gouge to roughly shape the rim. Then I started cutting into the resin, confident that the gouge would be okay, and after all there was a softwood waste block in there, so I didn't foresee any problems. A quick check to see how it was going, then I went back at it with a gouge. A few more cuts and I would be switching to the carbide, and then it happened. The gouge grabbed, wrenching the bowl off the chuck, and as you can see, the result was a bit exciting. The mortise wasn't that badly damaged, but I decided to cut it deeper, and this is where another problem started. No matter how I tried, I couldn't get the bowl centred on the lathe. I thought I got it close enough to redo the mortise, so I did cut that deeper, but when I refixed the bowl to the 4-jaw chuck, it was still off centre. I thought I would be able to work with it, so I started to hollow out. This time I only used the gouge to shape the segmented rim. As I worked on the rim, I thought the bowl would get better balanced, but as you can see from the way the lathe is shaking, it wasn't working. I persevered, removing material on the upper part of the outer surface, but eventually I had to admit defeat. There was nothing for it except to redo the whole of the outside of the bowl. This is why it didn't show me applying the finish, as it all had to be redone. Thankful that I hadn't chosen to cut away all the resin on the base, thereby making the bowl smaller, I set to reshaping the outer surface. Now I did film myself doing it, but I'm not going to show it. After all, it's just a repeat of what you've already seen. So let's skip ahead to where I start hollowing out. It's now around 1 hour later, the outside is done, and the bowl is now completely balanced with not a hint of vibration. Taking the full-size carbide cutter, I started to remove the waste material, working my way down to the top of the timber blank in the base. When the oak began to show through, I concentrated on thinning the side down. Using a carbide cutter, I made sweeping cuts from the rim down into the base, stopping frequently to check the thickness of the resin. With this bowl, I wanted to keep the wall thickness to around 10mm, 3/8 of an inch, so the finished piece had some weight to it. And once I was more or less there, I switched to the bowl gouge and cautiously began to remove the centre support. This was only softwood, but I took my time gradually thinning it down until it snapped off. With that out of the way, I checked to make sure the chuck was still tight in the mortise, then I cleaned up what was left. Just the last bit to do. The curves in the bowl were a bit too tight for my big negative rake scraper, so I used my smaller inboard bowl scraper. This has a standard grind. It's not negative rake, so care has to be taken on the resin. A few passes of this scraper and the inside of the bowl was done. After a final check, I sanded both inside and out from 80 to 400 grit, then continued up to 3000 grit on the resin. Then I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. After that, I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer, denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit, just a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue picks up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing, beginning with Merkur Polar Shine 10, just a single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Merkur Polar Shine 5, another single coat, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, a single application, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished, and this one turned out great, despite the hiccups along the way. First the colour, which isn't what I wanted, but it does look good. Then the remodel halfway through, which actually was a blessing. The refined profile looks so much better, and I hope you like it too. I chose to keep the mishaps in the video, as I always do, just to show my reality of making projects like this, so we can all learn, or at least that's the intention. But with that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, a thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.